Oh, there it is, finally.
Okay, off you go, Aline. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for switching off into coming onto Zoom. So I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you all for joining. As the title suggests, our focus today is going to be on focusing on... Sorry. As the title suggests, our focus today is on a pressing issue that affects individuals across various fields today, and that is burnout. So while this presentation is primarily tailored to BCBA supervisors, the information shared is relevant and beneficial to all participants here today. So to introduce myself, my name is Aline Atallah, is the board certified behavior analyst and the health and wellness specialist at Mohammed bin Rashid Center for Special Education. I have had the privilege of working closely with children with autism and their families since 2013. Throughout that time, I've gained valuable insights into the challenges and the rewards of supporting children with special needs and their families. However, I've also witnessed firsthand the toll that these responsibilities can take on individuals in our field. So my educational background in clinical psychology and an interest in the well-being of individuals in high-stress professions has brought my attention to the topic that we're discussing today. Objectives for this presentation are to define burnout and its costs, to identify prevention strategies for ourselves and our supervisees, and to understand the importance of self-care for resilience. So I am going to be sharing code words. So moving on now, what is burnout exactly? Before we dive in, let's have a look at a few of the images that popped up on Google when I just searched the word burnout. Images we can see reflect running on empty charge, feeling stretched out or spread thin, drowning in work tasks and losing focus or drive. And then the final one is being in a state that requires some serious restoration. And what I really want us to notice here is a common theme, which is the body is present, but the energy, the capacity, and full presence are missing. So this is important to note that we don't want to mistake that somebody being physically present at work means that they're being able to be fully present in all aspects. And then these images themselves give away the idea of what burnout is. But to properly define burnout, in May 2019, the World Health Organization recognized burnout not as a medical condition, but as an occupational phenomenon or syndrome that they defined as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So according to the latest edition of the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases, workplace burnout has three defining components. The first one being ongoing exhaustion and a persistent lack of energy, increased mental distance from one's job accompanied by feelings of negativity or cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy. It is important to distinguish between exhaustion and burnout, as they are key concepts to understand for the purpose of this presentation. Exhaustion and burnout are related, but they're not the same thing. So when we refer to exhaustion, we're talking about a state of physical or mental fatigue that's typically caused by exerting too much effort or energy, lack of sleep, or prolonged periods of stress. It's usually a temporary state that can be resolved with rest and basic self-care. On the other hand, when we talk about burnout, this is a more serious and more complex condition. It goes beyond exhaustion and it encompasses feelings of cynicism, detachment, and a reduced sense of accomplishment. Burnout is a chronic state where the mind and body are consistently taxed, requiring more than just rest for recovery. And so in summary, exhaustion is a symptom of burnout, but burnout encompasses broader and more chronic changes, including emotional, cognitive, and behavioral aspects. Sorry, I just got unmuted. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So to get back, excuse me, in summary, the key point to take here is that exhaustion is more temporary, can be resolved with some rest, but when someone goes to the point of burnout, this is usually more chronic and it includes emotional, cognitive, and behavioral aspects that change, which makes the costs of burnout quite substantial on both individuals and organizations. So on one hand, burnout imposes significant human costs, directly impacting the health and well-being of individuals. It can lead to physical and mental health problems, decreased job satisfaction, and strained familial and interpersonal relationships. On the other hand, organizations can also bear enormous costs, such as increased sick calls, high turnover rates, and decreased productivity that can lead to financial strains and hinder overall organizational effectiveness. So really, this is creating an urgent need not only to identify ways to recover from burnout, of course, that's always possible, but we really want to work more towards preventing it altogether, especially as supervisors. And to do that means to take time to understand how burnout can occur and what contributing factors are involved, because only when we understand that can we obviously move towards preventative strategies. So there are several models and theories available that provide a better understanding of how burnout can occur and how preventative strategies tie into it. One prominent model that I'm going to discuss is the job demands resources model of burnout. According to this model, burnout is a result of both exhaustion and disengagement from work. So exhaustion, as proposed by the authors, stems from high job demands, while disengagement emerges when there's a lack of resources to meet those demands. So when we talk about resources here, they can be both external or internal. External are ones that are referred to organizational or social factors. Internal resources are ones that are more related to cognitive features of individuals and their behavioral patterns. Taking a closer look at the model and how it explains the development of burnout, demanding aspects of work can lead to increased activation and effort. However, when these demands consistently overtax an individual, exhaustion may result. Remember here, exhaustion is temporary and can be resolved with some rest. If we get overtaxed at work, we work hard, some rest, we can recover, we're good. But in the absence of sufficient resources to meet these demands, the situation gets more complex. So here, overwhelm and withdrawal can start to emerge, eventually leading to disengagement, particularly if this cycle persists without intervention. So based on this model, it's this simultaneous presence of exhaustion and disengagement that characterizes burnout syndrome. And understanding this interplay between exhaustion and disengagement is vital if we wanted to work towards burnout prevention in our supervisory practices. So when we're considering what keeps employees healthy and resilient in the face of additional efforts or times of higher workload, the answer that these authors are providing is to pay attention very much so to the resources, keeping in mind that times of added workload are inevitable in the workplace. We're all going to face it time and time again, and this can surely lead to exhaustion. But the key point, again, is that exhaustion from excessive work alone does not necessarily result in the more serious and costly condition of burnout. The focus really lies on how much we can equip ourselves and others with the necessary resources so that they could rise to the occasion and effectively manage and cope with the increased demands. So when we prioritize this allocation of resources, we can then stand a chance to shift the tide away from burnout among our teams, among the caregivers that we work with even, fostering healthier and more resilient individuals and organizations. And this is where our role as supervisors comes in and where the next part of the presentation is going to focus. Whether burnout is already present or whether we want to prevent it from occurring, we have to realize that as supervisors, our influence is significant. We can guide the direction of the shift to protect ourselves and those that we work with from these costs of burnout. And importantly, we want to remember that cure is always possible. However, prevention is, of course, always better than cure. And that's really what we want to focus on. And there's good reason to pay attention to that. So again, as supervisors, as behavior analysts, one of our primary roles is to support the mission of our field, which is to offer high quality services to individuals and their families. We also understand that fulfilling this mission is only possible with dedication and well-being of our team members. Therefore, prioritizing our well-being and the well-being of those we work with becomes not just a responsibility, but also an ethical obligation, which is reflected in the BCBA Code of Ethics, where it's mentioned that we should refrain from working if services are compromised by personal circumstances. So notice here, the code is not saying that we should not have personal problems or circumstances, but it does acknowledge that they can affect our effectiveness and our ability to uphold ethical standards in our work if they are not managed well. So as Jennifer Moss, an expert on burnout, who I am going to introduce very shortly, has pointed out, we are currently facing a burnout epidemic, which puts all the above 3 points we just discussed at risk. So really, there is an urgency. We do need to be paying attention to this phenomenon as supervisors, and there's plenty of ways to do this. And at this point, you might be wondering, what can we do to address burnout? What are some things that we can adopt in our supervision practices to protect those that we work with from the risks of burnout? And luckily here again, we have Jennifer Moss. She, as I mentioned, is an expert on burnout. She conducted so much research and worked with organizations to tackle this issue and provided her valuable insights, all research-based, in this book titled The Burnout Epidemic. There's a lot of information in this book. The part that I'm going to be sharing is where she presents the 6 root causes of burnout, which were earlier identified by Maslach, Jackson, and Leiter, and then she provided strategies that can help mitigate these risks associated with each cause, which we're going to go into right now, about how we can use our supervisory practice to buffer against burnout. So introducing the 6 root causes, I'll begin by listing them out, and then we can go into each one. The root causes for burnout are 1, workload, perceived lack of control, a lack of reward or recognition, poor relationships, lack of fairness, and values mismatched.
Yung QR code sa team, sinend ko sa'yo.
What we really want to focus on is, yes, burnout is real. Yes, burnout has high costs, but we want to shift into that problem solution mindset. And luckily, we do have great suggestions for how we can tackle each root cause. So if we move to supervision strategies suggested by Moss, to tackle each cause, we'll start with root cause number 1, which is workload. It's no surprise that job demands like high work volume, time pressure, and conflicting. Sorry, I'm just going to ask that everybody please mute themselves. Thank you. So it's no surprise that job demands such as high work volume, time pressure, and conflicting responsibilities can all overwhelm individuals and lead to burnout. So some strategies to address this cause and things we can do specifically are: 1, when possible, we can consider adjusting the workload. Of course, that's not always possible, but something to start with is a simple strategy. Other things we can be mindful of in our supervisory practices is clear direction. So making sure that all staff know exactly what's expected of them can help them focus their efforts and reduce the need for redoing tasks due to lack of direction. This ties into the next point of providing guidance on task prioritization and being mindful of any false urgencies that can further overwhelm teams and staff members. So as Moss suggested in her book, when we're addressing workload issues, it's important to consider not only the quantity of work, but also how it's perceived and managed by staff, ourselves included. 4th one is maintaining safe and open communication channels with other members that we work with to encourage questions and requests for help as needed. Increasing check-ins despite limited time is another strategy to consider. These check-ins can be brief but focused, providing an opportunity to assess if other members that we're working with are taking breaks, understanding expectations, managing their time effectively. They also allow supervisors to be aware of any temporary factors that might be impacting an employee's capacity to handle workload, fostering a healthy professional relationship, and helping us also be able to identify if any staff are unable to perform up to ethical standards because of any pressing issues going on. And then we want to also encourage staff or supervisees to be taking breaks and to recharge. And anytime I speak of things we want to encourage our staff to do, I am automatically assuming that we're going to be practicing that ourselves as leaders, as supervisors who want to be also leading the way and being role models and all of these things that we're trying to do for our supervisees. So really, even when workloads are high, without rest and rejuvenation, burnout definitely becomes more likely. We want to be reminding our supervisees to maintain a healthy work-life balance and to be modeling that ourselves. An important note that I do want to make here is that ourselves or those that we supervise might sometimes work very hard, but it's under passion-driven effort. It's enjoyable, we love it, there's no complaints about it. But just because the passion is high does not mean that the risk of burnout is eliminated. So as supervisors, we should be encouraging rest and we should be protecting time off for supervisees because we don't want to run the risk of burning out their own passion and their own love for their job or even our own. And then another point is investing in training and skill development. This is crucial because really nobody should be left to fend for themselves for too long when facing challenging tasks. So robust Robust training programs help increase competence, confidence, and engagement while reducing overwhelm, confusion, and burnout. So it's really important here to focus on staff strengths to see what skills are needed to be learned in order to help them meet the demands that are higher or that would be coming up in the future. And lastly, whenever we can, is gathering feedback from those that we work with and from supervisees. This is always valuable. Anytime we can learn from previous periods of high workload or higher challenges, this can inform future strategies to improve resilience at work. Feedback can shed light on what worked well, what needed improvement, and how supervisors' involvement can be tailored to support teams and supervisees effectively. Moving on to root cause number 2, the idea here is that for any individual to perform at their best, they need to feel some control and autonomy over themselves and their work life. So otherwise, a perceived lack of control or autonomy over one's work can contribute to feelings of burnout. To mitigate the perceived lack of control and reduce the risk of burnout associated to this root cause, the following strategies can be implemented. So one is providing opportunities for our supervisees to be involved in decisions whenever we can, and to make sure that we are also actively taking some control over our work by being involved in decision-making processes. We also really want to be mindful of micromanagement because this can lead to loss of control and autonomy, not just for the supervisees, but for supervisors as well. So as supervisors, we do want to be very self-aware of our own tendencies towards micromanagement. Sometimes we might feel when we are stressed, micromanaging gives us control and makes us feel better, but we really want to be very mindful of this because it does reduce the feelings of autonomy that ourselves or our supervisees might be having. So it's important to strive for a balance where we're not micromanaging, but also we do want to have a level of involvement where staff feel supported, and then making sure that we're not being completely absent, thinking that we're giving independence when really staff needed us to be involved. So taking time to understand who we're talking to, what people need from us, not being absent in times where we were needed for support, but also not micromanaging at times where staff needed to be a little bit more independent. And this brings me to the next strategy, which is always having a plan to fade out support, especially towards supervisees that we work with. So while micromanagement may be necessary and helpful in some situations, especially for staff members who require significant support or who are new to a task or to an organization, it's important to know when and how to fade out this level of involvement. So recognize that what worked before may not work forever and provide the necessary support and guidance for staff members to become more independent and more confident in their roles. Another strategy is to ensure that we always foster a safe communication culture. This is essential for staff autonomy, as it enables us and enables others to have open dialogue, engage in active listening, show empathy towards others. We can all feel safe to express needs, express concerns, uncertainties without being feared of any judgment or negative repercussions. So it's really important to embrace different ideas and approaches to tasks and to promote a culture of collaboration and trust. And lastly, job crafting, where and when possible, is an excellent way to allow ourselves and the people that we work with some control over the work. So this involves tailoring roles to align with strengths, interests, passions. It empowers us and empowers others to shape job responsibilities to find more meaning and more satisfaction in the work. So when we give our supervisees the opportunity to utilize unique skills and unique preferences that they might have, this can definitely help promote autonomy and promote a sense of control in the workplace, which of course can then help reduce the risk of burnout. Moving on to lack of reward or recognition. So if we learn anything from behavior analysis, it's that reinforcement is very powerful in shaping behavior, and that behavior goes where reinforcement flows. So it's no surprise that insufficient recognition, rewards, or feedback for one's efforts can greatly diminish motivation and contribute to burnout. Some strategies we can employ here is, for one, recognition. We do want to make sure that we remain attentive to our supervisees' efforts and their achievements. When efforts and achievements go unacknowledged between peers and supervisors, research has shown that there's then a risk of staff losing connection to a greater organizational mission, as well as a loss of self-esteem. And we really don't want that. Staff want to recognize, Supervisors want to recognize what supervisees are doing well, and supervisees also want to recognize what their supervisors are doing well. When there's that back and forth, I notice what you're doing, I see your efforts, I see your support, I see how you work through that hard time. This can really boost that resilience and that healthy relationship, which buffers against burnout. And then, of course, beyond just recognizing hard work comes the rewards. So rewards can be both financial and social. As supervisors or employees, where we likely have more control over the social rewards bit, which is a pretty big one. So we know that constructive feedback is necessary for professional and personal growth. And while we expect that staff perform certain duties, we never want to forget to mention that we also notice what they're doing well. So delivering positive feedback is a great way not only to reward positive performance, but we also want to be using it to reward qualities that we notice in others. It could be things like decision-making or showing empathy towards a family that was struggling or had a challenge, kindness, enthusiasm, support, the ability to say no or to respectfully enforce healthy boundaries at work. That's a great quality and an attribute that we do want to be reinforcing as supervisors, because we know that healthy boundaries can also buffer against burnout. So these things can go a long way in protecting our staff from burnout as they feel noticed, valued, and supported. And finally, we want to make sure that we actually know how our staff like to be recognized and rewarded. To emphasize on this point, I'm going to share a real life scenario that Jennifer brought up in her book, where recognition and reward led to unintended negative consequences. So here we have a salesman, his name's Barry. In his post, he shared a story about how he got rewarded and recognized, but it actually had unintended consequences and was more aversive for him. So he writes, "My boss posted my picture in the company's lobby as our #1 salesman. I spent my career trying to prove to prospects and customers that I was concerned with solving their problems and helping them succeed. That, after all, was why I was the #1 salesperson. But with one glance, that picture destroyed all that work, turning me in their eyes into someone whose goal was to sell them rather than someone trying to help them buy what they needed." So this anecdote emphasizes an important point highlighted by Jennifer in her book, which is that good intentions don't always prevent negative outcomes. When it comes to rewarding and recognizing our staff, it's crucial to consider the how and what works best for each individual. So for example, not all employees might appreciate public recognition. So understanding their preferences and tailoring our approach accordingly can make a significant difference and can only successfully buffer against burnout if we're using it thoughtfully. And this, of course, includes making sure that we are communicating to people we work with how we like to be rewarded or recognized so that unintended consequences are less likely. Moving on to the fourth root cause of burnout, and that is poor relationships. So poor social support and a lack of positive relationships in the workplace can contribute to burnout. There was actually a Deloitte survey that was done on diversity and inclusion, and it revealed that workplace belonging can lead up to a 56% increase in job performance, 50% reduction in turnover risk, and 75% decrease in employee sick days. The study also found that a single instance of micro-exclusion can result in a 25% decline in team project performance. So really, these statistics are pointing out to how important working relationships are for our workplace and for buffering against burnout. So for healthy relationships to be nurtured at work, these were the recommendations that we got from Jennifer Moss. So one, we want to make sure that communication is always rooted in empathy, especially when delivering feedback. We want to try our best to reflect empathy and understanding in how we relay our messages. Secondly, we want to try to be physically connecting people as much as we can together, being in the same physical space, whether it's us for the others, the more we're in the same space, sharing coffee breaks, morning greetings, having non-work related conversations. This builds stronger support networks and has a great buffer against burnout, given that relationships at work are a massive aspect of workplace well-being. So the more we give time for that, no matter how busy it gets, the more likely we are to have to build that resilience against burnout. And then performing acts of altruism, whether it's through volunteer work, community work, a common cause, engaging in acts like this, going together as a team and working on these things can definitely strengthen ties between employees, nurturing relationships between staff who work together, thus again, reducing the risk of burnout. We also want to make sure that we are monitoring unhealthy competition. Some competition can sometimes be healthy. It brings in motivation, but in excess, it can actually lead to stress, secrecy, defensiveness, and some predatory behavior. So we really want to be, as supervisors, monitoring any unhealthy competition and focusing more on common values and common goals. And lastly, we want to promote an inclusive work environment to encourage staff to support each other, recognizing that individual progress contributes to collective growth. Moving on to root cause number 5, which is lack of fairness. So perceived unfairness or inequality in the workplace, such as favoritism or inconsistent treatment, can contribute to burnout. And the way that we can tackle this is, 1, establishing a complaint mechanism. This can help us detect and address any unfair or problematic situations within a team. Also making sure that there's a shared corporate awareness about what constitutes unfair treatment. And of course, as supervisors, we want to be modeling that appropriate behavior and ensuring that it permeates through teams or organizations that we work with. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we take every grievance seriously and respond promptly, and then actively investigating events and providing healthy work environments during any investigation process. Moving to the final root cause, which is values mismatch. When an employee's, whether it's ours or our supervisees, if the values differ from those of the organization, the motivation and the perseverance can significantly decline. And then anybody also who might feel overqualified for the role, they might feel deprived of their potential and personal goals. And these, of course, are very risky for disengaging from work, paired with exhaustion, as we know, can lead to burnout. So we really want to make sure that values are aligned, as this is a great buffer against burnout, so the staff can stay engaged and committed to the overall mission of the company, which is aligned with the values of the individual. So here we want to address any values mismatches that we might see in our supervisees, and how we do that. There are 3 steps. So first of all, Jennifer Moss lists out 3 steps. First one being find the path. So take time to get to know supervisees, understand what their goals are. What do they hope to achieve? Where do they want to be? Where are they right now, and where do they hope to be in the future? Because as we get to know our supervisees, then we can communicate a plan with them. So clearly communicate the steps and the requirements that are necessary for staff to progress from their current position to a desired position, for example, or where are you right now with your skill set? Which skill set do you wish to, have by the end of so-and-so? Having a plan where their values are clear, the goals are clear, and we're helping our supervisees go towards what's meaningful for them. The more we're aligned with what's meaningful, the more likely we are to stay engaged with our work, which means that we're protected from burnout, knowing that our work is meaningful, purposeful, and that we're working towards a mission that means something to us. So of course, this can also involve in discussing any necessary skills, education, or training that's required. And then comes realizing the goals. So help staff and supervisees see how their efforts and their progress are getting them closer to their goals. Provide clear goals, regular check-ins, evaluations, tracking progress, evaluating progress, all of this, and offering support in the process. And as we start to match goals and provide clear plans, supervisors can then bridge misunderstandings and help their supervisees work toward their aspirations, reducing the likelihood of burnout. So having shared the 6 root causes, along with some preventative strategies that we can incorporate into our work as supervisors, I'm going to wrap up the first part of our talk by generally reviewing some implications that we can take away as supervisors. So in summary, addressing burnout starts with self-reflection and taking responsibility for our own contributions to a problem. So it's important to ask ourselves questions about how are we managing our workload? Are we able to delegate? Are we communicating? Are we practicing self-care, which we'll talk about in just a little bit? So by identifying areas where we can improve, we take proactive steps to prevent burnout. The other point here is we really want to understand that burnout doesn't just happen. Employers and researchers have found that burnout often stems from very small irritants that accumulate over time rather than major issues that come up. So it's really crucial for supervisors to be attentive and to be involved, to have conversations with the staff that we work with, and to identify and address burnout early on. The earlier we can address it, the more we can implement preventative strategies, the more we can shift that tide that we talked about. It is so much more effective to take time to prevent burnout when we're talking supervisors amongst each other. There's so much to do where, a lot of us could be overworked and you would think, I don't have time to be doing these check-ins. I don't have time to be doing all that stuff. But really, the fact is that the effort required to prevent burnout is worth it. And is actually the effort required to prevent it is a lot less than the effort required to bring somebody back from burnout. When someone is in a state of chronic burnout, it takes so much longer to recover than the time that would be needed to even prevent it from happening in the first place. So it's definitely worth it. We did discuss the costs of burnout. We can have amazing staff who are so dedicated and are great at their jobs who end up going downhill simply because they didn't know how to take care of themselves or something went wrong over time. So that's really what we want to be preventing as supervisors. And then we also want to remember that even though individual desire sets the spark, it's collective effort that generates the impact. So we do want this to be a collective effort. The more we can be aware of burnout and how to prevent it, the more we can educate our supervisees to prevent it and what they can do to take care of themselves, the more we can generate that collective will in order to all work together to reduce the reduce risks of burnout and then be able to work towards long-lasting change. So all things said, we're now going to be moving into self-care. So self-care is self-care is a concept that's often discussed in relation to burnout and overall well-being. And there's so much going on with self-care right now in the wellness industry. Promoting self-care as a means to prevent or manage burnout, but we do want to examine its effectiveness. Really, the question is, does self-care really help to reduce the risks of burnout? Luckily, we have Sloyak and Delon Chang who researched this in their 2021 in their published article, where they studied burnout amongst behavior analysts. And in this study, the authors looked at self-care strategies and job crafting practices among behavior analysts and whether they predict perceptions of work-life balance, work engagement, and burnout. And this is where we're going to start moving a little bit away from external resources that can help us to more internal resources that can be available to any and all of us. So based on these researchers and the authors of this article, similar to the model we explored earlier, they explained burnout to happen when high job demands are met by insufficient job supportive resources, leading to both mental and physical exhaustion. Left unattended, these stressors can lead to burnout. So when they did their research, I won't go into too much detail. I'm going to jump right into the findings, but I would be happy to share this article. What they found is that individually and collectively, self-care strategies and job crafting practices can improve life-work balance, work engagement, which in turn reduces burnout. They also found that the strongest buffers against exhaustion were 1, maintaining a life balance through self-care strategies, which is in line with the researchers' initial hypothesis, and 2, the surprising finding is quite opposite to what the researchers hypothesized, and this is that it's actually increasing challenging demands that buffered against exhaustion. And this finding led the researchers to suggest that increasing challenging job demands isn't necessarily what leads to burnout, as we are also seeing with the other models. Instead, if it's complemented with the right resources, it can increase engagement. And we know that it's not exhaustion alone that leads to burnout, it's if it's paired with disengagement. So when work demands are high, especially if it's from job crafting, where a staff is involved in the decision, has autonomy over their work, decided I want to be doing this or I want to be involved in this project, higher demand can actually help us be engaged, which can actually reduce the risk of burnout. So moving on to the final finding here, self-care was found to be a stronger predictor compared to the other factors of work-life balance, work engagement, and reducing burnout. And this is very, very hopeful. And again, for this talk, we're not really exploring specific self-care strategies we can do. We want to really look at it from a more analytical perspective and examine, is self-care actually helpful? Is it worth taking time to take care of ourselves and to encourage our supervisees do the same? And the research shows that it's absolutely worth it. We know high demands are not enough to lead to burnout. And we know self-care practices can be a source of internal resources that we use to meet high work demand. Put these together, and we have something that's totally in our control that is of the strongest buffers against burnout. And then I wanted to share this quote taken directly from the article. When we mindfully choose to focus our attention on what we care about most, we open ourselves up to the possibility of contacting new sources of reinforcement that were not available to us before. The painful aspects of our experience do not disappear, but they're no longer the sole focus of our attention. And what I love so much about this quote is it's not that self-care is going to eliminate every challenge in our life. It's not that it's just that self-care can bring us in touch with more reinforcers, despite the challenges that are present. And that's what we know behavior analysis aims to do, to improve the quality of life for individuals. So it just makes whatever's going on a little bit more bearable, protecting our well-being, allowing us to show up whole and to keep providing services to those under our care from a place that is full rather than a place that's getting depleted. So how do we engage in proper self-care, and how can we help our supervisees do the same? In another published article, which was titled An Invitation to Act on the Value of Self-Care, Feebig and colleagues invite us to view self-care as a value in and of itself. So this means viewing self-care as an overarching umbrella under which many behaviors can exist, and the function of those behaviors being to improve an individual's health and well-being. Further, the author suggests that self-care is not about the action itself. It's rather the outcome of engaging in behavior that congruently pairs an action to a value. So for example, if you value meditation and you take time for it and you engage in it, that is self-care. But if you engage in meditation because it works for somebody else and it doesn't really mean much to you, that's actually going to have a counter effect. So of course, we want to try different things and experiment and get ideas, but the most important thing is that self-care is not a specific action, and that it must be very congruent with your own values and supervisees' values for it to work. So the requirements, so to speak, to engage in proper self-care are: 1, to clarify and commit to the overarching value of self-care, to value self-care in and of itself, knowing that it's going to help us maintain our well-being and combat burnout. 2, it's committing to acting congruently with personal and professional values across various domains of living. And then we want to be able to practice self-compassion in the process, which is also an act of self-care, because we know that some things might work sometimes, some things might take time to work. We might not know what works for us best just yet. So that's why we need self-compassion in the process to be able to identify what works best for us. So to clarify what self-care is not, it is not a one-time fix. And the example I like to give here is dental hygiene. We don't wait until our teeth have cavities and then we brush our teeth and think it's going to do the trick. Instead, we take a few minutes every single day to brush our teeth so we can prevent cavities in the first place and to maintain overall dental hygiene. Same thing applies when we talk about self-care and maintaining our well-being and preventing burnout. So we want to engage in self-care activities every day and regularly for it to work. Next, it's not always a collective experience. It's rather very situational and very circumstantial. Sometimes some things might work, sometimes they might not. Sometimes I have the time, sometimes I don't. So activities might vary. Again, it's not about the action itself. It's about how that action makes me feel and whether it's aligned with my value or not. Also, we need to remember preferences vary. So what I might like now or what might help me now can change another time. And what works for me might not work for somebody else. And it's also, self-care is not always active. We do live in a world right now where it's all about go, 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 do, but we really want to know that sometimes just stopping and saying, I want to do nothing. I just want to rest and lay back. That's an act of self-care in itself. So it's not always doing something. Sometimes it can just be being and doing nothing. Moving into clarifying a little bit more about what it is. Self-care is a set of behaviors. So again, we want to view it as an overarching umbrella that includes many, many behaviors that fall under it, that all fall under the domain of self-care, so to speak. So we can think of it as a domain. And when we talk about wellness, there are actually different domains of wellness. We have mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, social, occupational, environmental, and financial. So for self-care to work best, we want to have behaviors that would address individual needs in each of these domains. Also, like any other behavior, self-care requires learning, generalization, and maintenance. So if self-care skills are not currently in our skill set repertoire or that of our supervisees, we need to remember that we can learn them and that it requires generalization and that it requires maintenance and that we need to keep doing it for it to work. We also want to know that self-care is addressing any skill deficits we have in this domain of self-care. So deficits in self-care skills have actually been associated to stress, higher levels of stress, compassion fatigue, burnout, and diminished outcomes at work. So we really want to make sure that whatever skill deficits we have, we want to know that we can learn them. It's a behavior like any other behavior. And knowing which one to target really depends on what your values are and what helps you replenish your energy. And that, of course, takes some experimentation. We also want to ensure that we have both preventative as well as remediation strategies. So if right now I had a very long day and I feel exhausted, what's my self-care strategy? If right now I feel good, but I want to maintain this feeling, what's my preventative strategy? So having a varied toolbox that meets individual and changing needs is key, so we can ensure that we're able to take care of ourselves. So altogether, self-care is a behavioral skill repertoire that's foundational for our whole being, goals, visions, and overall quality of life. Bringing me to a statement that I heard a speaker named Dr. Shane Spiker mention in one of his presentations at a previous ABA-I conference. I'm not sure if it's his, but I thought it was brilliant. And that is that you can't do Skinner until you do Maslow, which suggests that addressing basic human needs and psychological well-being, as proposed by Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we're seeing here, is a necessary foundation before we can implement behaviorist principles. So in other words, if I'm working with a supervisee and I want to help the supervisee gain skills, become a great behavior analyst, improve skills in the workplace, if basic needs are not met, it's going to be very difficult to help that staff reach higher level goals, higher level skills. Same for us. If we might have the biggest aspirations, the greatest goals, it all looks great on paper, but if our basic needs are not met, it's very difficult to engage in higher level behavior change that brings us close to higher aspirations if we're not taking care with basic self-care, basic energy, the basic things that keep us going. That said, what are some examples of self-care? Because I'm trying to discuss it from a more behavior analytic perspective, but I do want to leave you with some examples also to highlight how it's not about how it looks, it's about the little things. So self-care can be medical checks. You know, we always say when we're implementing behavior change with, for example, kids with autism that we work with, first thing we like to do is rule out medical problems. Same thing applies to us. If we feel more tired, more moody, whatever it is, maybe something's wrong with our blood work. Maybe it's a thyroid issue. Maybe it's hydration. So ruling out the medical is a starting point, and that's self-care, and making sure that our health is in check. Next, and these I call the non-negotiable basics. Self-care means, are we getting good sleep? Are we engaging in movement? Are we staying hydrated? Good nutrition. These are basics and are essential for any living human. No matter how overwhelming things get, it's good to remember that at least these things need to be in check for us to have basic needs met, to be able to do more and to give more. Another example is setting healthy boundaries. Community work about a valued cause. Taking vacations and weekends and really taking them and disconnecting and getting time off of work. Engaging in fun and play, not just work hard, and learning to prioritize. So I really wanted to put these examples here because sometimes we associate self-care to going for a massage, going for a meditation, going for a retreat. Of course, these are all beautiful things, but we want to understand that self-care is more than just that. It's an umbrella with a lot of behaviors under it that go towards what we need the most. Michelle, do I have a couple more minutes?
Yes, absolutely, Aline. Go first.
Thank you. All right, so now we might be thinking, all right, I want to increase my engagement and self-care practices. I want to help my supervisees do the same because I know this is so beneficial for them to combat burnout. How can we support ourselves and supervisees engage? And we know behavior means something is either enabling behavior or something is either getting in the way of behavior taking place. And if we apply behavior analysis here, we do want to remember, like all behaviors, self-care behavior is subject to environmental arrangements. So we want to look here, what are the motivating operations? What abolishing operations are at play that's getting in the way of practicing certain self-care behavior? What establishing operations are enabling self-care for happening? Can we consider some visual prompts, some calendar reminders, maybe use technology and download an app that reminds me to stop and take a few breaths every hour? So these are environmental arrangements that we can do to support behavior change. Also, we want to get to the source of the stress. We want to know what's stressing us out before we can think about how to deal with stress. And here's an interesting thing to think about. When we look at dealing with stress or finding relief from stress, sometimes we engage in behavior that gives us immediate relief, right? Negative reinforcement. This is great in the moment, but the source is not targeted. And that it's a risk, because then that's how experiential avoidance comes up. If I don't know how to do a skill, I escape it, for example, by procrastinating. I'm going to end up avoiding anything to do with that skill for a long time, and I won't build what I need to get better because of that immediate relief where I avoided negative reinforcement. Great, I feel relieved of needing to do this, but then I never learn what I need to learn. But also, on the other hand, sometimes not contacting relief or immediate reinforcement can be a risk because of delayed discounting. So these are just different things we want to think about when we're looking for self-care and what could be getting in the way of doing something or not doing something. And we also want to think about core skill analysis. You know, sometimes when I start BCBA supervision, the first conversation I have with my supervisees is, what do you do to practice self-care? What are the things that you do to look after yourself? And I try to assess, are the core skills of self-care there, such as how's your sleep? How often do you take breaks? How's your hydration across the day? Are you eating well? How do you prioritize tasks, etc.? So all of these things that we can look at to rule out what can lead to burnout and nip it in the bud before it becomes a long-term and chronic issue. For further application of ABA to enhancing self-care repertoires, it can help to analyze patterns which are either enhancing or hurting well-being. So let's say you have a stressor followed by a response, followed by a consequence, right? That's the basic ABC analysis of behavior. First scenario, a stressor was met by a self-care behavior and provided relief. So I felt like I had so much work to do, I got stressed, I engaged in self-care, maybe I took a step back, went for a walk, took a breath, and then I came back to the task. I felt more clear-minded, I was able to complete my work more calmly, and I felt relieved of my stress. Here, relief led to negative reinforcement. I was more likely to engage in this behavior in the future, and I've preserved my sense of well-being. In another scenario, a stressor leads to a response where I engage in a behavior that contacts more stressors. So maybe in this case, I felt stressed, I got overwhelmed with work, and then I started to dive deeper into my work because I felt like I can't take a break, I have so much work to do, and then I contacted more and more stressors, and then I just got trapped into a vicious stress cycle, and then I find myself flooding in the first stimuli. I feel overwhelmed, and I've put myself So the point of going through this analysis is because when we're thinking about behavior change planning, when it comes to self-care, we want to think assessment so we can have function-based intervention. Again, whether it's for ourselves or our supervisees. We want to assess the problem behavior. What is it that's causing burnout or leading to burnout? What is it that's making a staff so exhausted and overwhelmed and unable to complete work or to feel well? And then we want to isolate contingencies. What is it that's going on exactly? What's the skill deficit here? What type of self-care behavior is needed in this situation? And there's a skill deficit, and the staff or myself need to learn a specific skill. And then I want to determine a replacement behavior. So I just gave this scenario. Okay, so when you're so flooded with work and overwhelmed and you block, do you dive in deeper into work, or can the replacement be to take a step back, go for a walk, have a cup of water, and then come back to it? So we want to know what's a replacement behavior to the problem behavior. And then we want to make sure that we identify environmental changes that support that behavior change. We want to reduce exposure to aversive conditions that contribute to suffering or contribute to burnout, because again, self-care, like any other behavior, is we can apply ABA right to it to make it work successfully. And then we also want to establish conditions that help ourselves and staff contact reinforcement of some kind. If we want to feel good from exercising, rather than aim for 1 hour to begin with, maybe aim for 10. Contact that reward of, wow, those endorphins, I feel good. and then start to increase the time. So we want to think about how to set things up for success. Coming to the end of the presentation, we also want overall to be thinking about creating a culture of self-care. So this is a culture that's created, we do live in a culture, unfortunately, that has created a large self-care deficit. You know, there's all that thought about work hard, play hard, burning ourselves down to the ground. Burnout is worn like a badge of honor. We want to shift away from that. And we want to be thinking about context and contingencies and how much these matter when we want to establish self-care practices, because again, research supports that it is so important to have self-care practices. And that's the most thing that's in our control to help us combat against burnout. So reinforcement is powerful, but the power lies in where it's directed. So as supervisors, we want to make sure we're not reinforcing behavior that leads to burnout. We don't want to be saying, well done for working on the weekend. Maybe you want to recognize it so it doesn't go unnoticed, but you do want to encourage staff like, look, I appreciate that you're working hard, but it is important for me that you take this time off. I need you to restore your energy. So we want to be mindful where we're not reinforcing working hard so much that we're actually reinforcing behavior that leads to burnout. So if we look at what causes, if we look at the causes of burnout that we talked about at the beginning of this talk, let those inform what we should be reinforcing. We want to be reinforcing, for example, how staff are great at organizing and prioritizing tasks, how they reinforce boundaries and say no if they can't take on more or are unable to do something, how they switch off and recharge, appropriate delegation, asking for help, connecting with other people, team bonding, all these things that we know combat burnout. That's what we want to be focusing on. So as supervisors, we really want to be supporting rather than becoming barriers to employee wellness. We want to help supervisees become aware of their well-being, of course, after being aware of our own. We want to serve as a source of professional support, and we want to provide reinforcement for engaging in self-care strategies and job crafting practices, leading to take-away home points for today, that we're really past the point of questioning the severity or the risks of burnout. We do want to realize that there's an interplay between personal life and professional life. They can pour over to each other. We cannot separate them completely. And the more attentive we are to how it's impacting us and our supervisees, the more we can take the necessary intervention strategies needed to combat burnout. We always want to remember cure is possible. If somebody's here is already feeling burnt out or working with somebody burnt out, it's not the end of the world. It's very possible to cure, to find a cure, but we do want to think about prevention as being key and to be preventative as much as we can. We do want to be open to ongoing learning and experimenting to know what's needed, what's right, what feels good, what doesn't, to promote and ensure best practices in supervision and service provision. And then holding accountability to others and ourselves as leaders and supervisors is essential for positive change. Ending with a final quote by Jennifer Moss. This is always a two-way street. It's a we problem to solve. To prevent burnout, we have to identify when we've lost self-compassion, when we've stopped giving to ourselves enough room for error. We're living beyond our margins. We may be leaders, but we're also human. If we are truly interested in helping others, we have to help ourselves first. Then we'll be ready to do the work. So ultimately, it has to start with us and then ripple through us. I do thank you all for being here. Sorry about the little change that happened, but I appreciate you being here. I hope this was helpful. Sorry, there's not much time for questions and comments, but if anything does come up, please contact Michelle and I'll be happy to offer any answers or resources.